Okay, we're on about page 10, the top of page 10. Robert Moses was unquestionably America's most prolific physical creator. He was America's greatest builder. More significant than what Robert Moses built is when he built it. That was how he put his mark on all the cities in America. When Robert Moses began building state parks and parkways during the 1920s, 29 states didn't have a single state park. 6 had only one each. Roads, uninterrupted by crossings at grade and set off by landscaping, were almost non existent. Most proposals for parks outside cities were so limited in scope that even if they had been adopted, they would have been inadequate. The handful of visionaries who dreamed of large parks were utterly unable to translate their dreams into reality. No one in the nation seemed able to conceive of proposals and methods of implementing them equal to the scope and complexity of the problem posed by the need of urban masses for countryside parks and a convenient means of getting to them. New York City residents heading for Long Island's green hills and ocean beaches, for example, had to make their way bumper to bumper along dusty, rutted roads, the most modern of which were exactly 18 feet wide. Those who made it to the island found that the hills and beaches had been monopolized by the robber barons of America, who had bought up its choicest areas with such thoroughness that there was hardly a meadow or strip of beach within driving distance of New York still open to the public. So fierce was their opposition, and so immense their political power, that New York park enthusiasts had stopped thinking of putting parks on Long Island. But in 1923, after tramping alone for months over sand spits and almost wild tracts of Long Island woodland, Robert Moses mapped out a system of state parks that would cover 40,000 acres and would be linked together and to New York City by broad parkways. And by 1929, Moses had actually built the system he had dreamed of. Hacking it out in a series had actually built the system hacking it out in a series of merciless vendettas against wealth and wealth power that became almost a legend to the public and to public officials and engineers from all over the country who came to Long Island to marvel at his work. When Jones Beach, capstone of the system, opened it opened to nationwide praise of unanimity and enthusiasm, not to be heard again for a public work until the completion of the Tennessee Valley Authority project a decade later, and states parks built on engineering and I'm bad at reading right now. States built on engineering and philosophic principles that came largely out of the old August Belmont mansion on Long Island, where Robert Moses sat, pounding his palm on what had been Belmont's dinner table and planning out a system far vaster than Long Island's for all New York State. Over the decades, the state park movement developed other leaders, but it was always to be in his debt. And there was never to be any doubt that the breadth of his vision kept him unique within its ranks. At the end of his leadership of the New York system, the total acreage of the state parks in those 50 states was 5,799,957. New York State alone had 2,567,256 of those acres, or 45% of all the state parks in the country. To a few men, young engineers whose passion had been fired by a dramatic facet of their profession, the construction of highways, the Belmont Mansion, was Delphi. They came to it to learn, not just the engineering of great roads, for they could learn engineering elsewhere, but rather a secret available at that time nowhere else, the secret of how to get great roads built. For them, the big table at which Moses sat was an altar on which they laid their dreams in the hope of learning the alchemy by which the dreams might be transmuted into concrete and asphalt and steel. And they were luckier than the Greeks, whose journey to the oracle was over narrow mountain paths. They were able to drive to the mansion on the Southern State Parkway, and they could still recall, decades later, their awe at first seeing its stone-faced bridges and opulent landscaping. And when they were admitted to the Belmont dining room, they were not spoken to in riddles, but in blunt lectures that contained a whole new doctrine on the building of urban public works in a democratic society. As the young men grew older, they became the road builders of America, the heads of state and city highway departments, key officials of the Federal Bureau of Public Roads, caterers of an orgy of public works without precedent in history. And as the roads they built rolled across America, the mark of Robert Moses was as much a part of those roads as the steel mesh on which their concrete pavement was laid. Bertram D. Tallamy, chief administrative officer of the interstate highway system during the 50s and 60s, says that the principles on which the system was built were principles that Robert Moses taught him in a series of such private lectures in 1926. Yeah, this is my first read of it. Parkways were, in general, laid through thinly populated suburbs or open countryside and were designated to carry only cars. Expressways would be laid after World War II through cities and were designated to carry trucks also, to serve as arteries for the commerce as well as the pleasure of people. When Robert Moses began building expressways, there were plenty of plans for expressways, but few expressways. Politicians boggled at two political problems that would attend the implementation of the plans: their fantastic costs and the necessity of removing from their path and relocating thousands, even tens of thousands, of voters. For years, decades, in every city in the country, the expressways remained on the drawing boards. In every city, that is, except one. In New York, immediately after World War II, Robert Moses began ramming 6 great expressways simultaneously through the city's massed apartment houses. A decade later, outside New York, there were still only a few stretches of urban expressway in the United States, but Moses' 6 pioneer expressways were largely completed. When, in 1956, sufficient funds to gridiron America with expressways were ensured by the passage of the Interstate Highway Act, an act in whose drafting Moses played a crucial, if hidden, role, it was to New York that the engineers of a score of state highway departments came to learn the secrets of the master. The greatest secret was how to remove people from the expressway's paths, and Robert Moses taught them his method of dealing with people. This method became one of the trademarks of the building of America's urban highways, a Moses trademark impressed on all of urban America. Robert Moses' influence on the development of the expressway system in the United States was greater than that of any other single individual. He was America's greatest road builder, the most influential single architect of the system over which rolled the wheels of America's cars. And there was, in this fact, an irony, for except for a few driving lessons he took in 1926, Robert Moses never drove a car in his life. In 1949, the federal government enacted a new approach to the housing problem of cities: urban renewal. The approach was new both in philosophy. For the first time in America, government was given the right to seize an individual's private property, not for its own use, but for reassignment to another individual for his use and profit, and in scope. $1 billion was appropriated in 1949, and it was agreed that this was only seed money to prepare the ground for later, greater plantings of cash. Most cities approached urban renewal with caution, but in New York City, urban renewal was directed by Robert Moses. By 1957, $133 million of public monies had been expended on urban renewal in all of the cities of the United States, with the exception of New York. $267 million had been spent in New York. So far ahead was New York that when scores of huge buildings constructed under its urban renewal program were already erected and occupied, administrators from other cities were still borrowing New York's contract forms to learn how to draw up the initial legal agreements with interested developers. When Moses resigned from his urban renewal directorship in 1960, urban renewal had produced more physical results in New York City than in all other American cities combined. Says the federal official in charge of the early years of the program, because Robert Moses was so far ahead of anyone else in the country, he had greater influence on urban renewal in the United States, on how the program developed, and on how it was received by the public than any other single person. Okay, so coffee sip break. Okay. Parks, highways, urban renewal. Robert Moses was in and of himself a formative force in all 3 fields in the United States. He was a seminal thinker, perhaps the single most influential seminal thinker in developing policies in these fields, and the innovator, perhaps the single most influential innovator in developing the methods by which these policies were implemented. And since parks, highways, and urban renewal taken together do so much to shape cities' total environment, how then gauge the impact of this one man on the cities of America? The man who was, for 30 years, his bitterest critic, Lewis Mumford says, quote, in the 20th century, the influence of Robert Moses on the cities of America was greater than that of any other person. With his power, Robert Moses built himself an empire. The capital of this empire was out of public sight, a squat gray building crouching so unobtrusively below the Randall's Island toll plaza of the Triborough Bridge that most of the motorists who drove through the tour booths never even knew that the building existed. And most of them were ignorant also of the existence of the empire. But men whose interest in geography centered on the map of power knew of its existence very well indeed. They realized that although theoretically it was only a creature of the city, it had in fact become an autonomous sovereign state. And realizing that, although its outward form was a loose confederation of 4 public authorities, plus the New York City Park Department and the Long Island State Park Commission, it was actually a single-headed, tightly administered monarchy. These men described it with a single name, derived from the bridge and the authority that were its centerpieces, Triborough. Anyone who doubted Triborough's autonomy had only to look at its trappings. The empire had its own flag and great seal, distinctive license plates, and a self-contained communications network, an elaborate teletype hookup that linked the Gray Building and the provincial capitals at Belmont Lake, Messina, and Niagara. It even had its own island, Randall's, on which it administered every structure and every inch of land. Randall's Island was near the geographic center of New York, but the waters of the East River, Bronx Kill, and Hell Gate were a moat between it and the city. And from the air, with its hundreds of acres of lawn, the island appeared separate, on a bright green oasis, sharply defined by a blue boulder in the middle of the city's vast grayness. And the separateness was more than symbolic. No inhabitant of the city could drive across the island without paying Triborough a tribute in coin. Triborough had its own fleets of yachts and motor cars and trucks and its own uniformed army, bridge and tunnel officers who guarded its toll booth, revolver-carrying Long Island Parkway police who patrolled its suburban parks and roads, responsible to no discipline but that of Robert Moses. To command the army under Moses, it had its own generals and admirals, senior officers of the United States Army and Navy who, upon retirement, took service under its banner. It had its own constitution, the covenants, unalterable by the city, state, or federal government, of its bond resolutions. It governed by its own laws, the rules and regulations that it promulgated to regulate conduct within its dominions, and most significantly, it had its own source of revenue. The quarters and dimes that poured in a silver stream into the toll booths at which it collected its tribute. It was a vast empire. In 1960, the year of furthest expansion, the land area under its direct control, the parks of Long Island and New York City, the highways and highway bordering playgrounds in the city, and the enclaves in which are placed the upstate power dams, totaled 103,071 acres, 161 square miles, an area half as large as New York City. But the best measure of the size of the empire was its wealth. Its annual income, the toll booth revenue, the fees it received for the use of electricity produced at Messina and Niagara, the yearly budgets of the Long Island State Park Commission and the City Park Department, ran as high as $213 million. The surplus of just one of its 4 constituent public authorities, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, ran almost $30 million a year. The courtiers and courtesans of this empire wallowed in an almost I don't even know how to say this, Carthaginian luxury. Favored secretaries, for example, had not only bigger cars than city commissioners, as well as round-the-clock chauffeurs so that they could be on call 24 hours a day, but also higher salaries. As for men closest to the throne, the cadre of Triborough administrators known as Moses men, not even his most suspicious critics ever came close to guessing the extent of the wealth he poured into their hands. He made not a handful, but scores of men. A low-salaried draftsman who caught his eye, a struggling young hot dog seller, architects, engineers, contractors, bankers, restaurateurs, concessionaires, developers, millionaires, and multimillionaires. Within this empire, Robert Moses lived like an emperor. Like an emperor, his every wish was foreseen. On Sundays, when he rested, one of the 3 boat captains who took turns skippering his favorite yacht waited by a telephone, sometimes for the entire day, just in case he might decide that he would want to go fishing. Like an emperor, he preferred his own table. People who wanted to dine with Moses had to come to him. And to ensure that he could entertain them on imperial scale, luxurious dining rooms were set up adjacent to the 4 offices, one at Randall's Island, one at Belmont Mansion, and 2 in downtown office buildings, among which he divided his time. Although only one of them could be used at a time, each of them was equipped with a full-time staff of chef and waiters. Luncheons were only one aspect of his hospitality. When a dam or park was waiting to be opened upstate, chartered planes flew hundreds of guests, not just to the opening, but to a whole weekend of lavish receptions. In New York, highly paid Triborough officials had as their principal duty the entertainment of Moses' guests. They conducted tours of the empire, pointing out its principal natural features, the towers of the Triborough Bridge marching like the facades of twin cathedrals across the East River, the long lawn of Riverside Park, and repeating at each monument the legends, burnished by time and constant retelling, of how Robert Moses had created it. And the thousands of guests at the summer capital of the empire, Jones Beach, were entertained in $1.5 million restaurant, whose main purpose, judging from its financial statements, was to entertain them. In a $4 million stadium that had turned over to his favorite band leader, Guy Lombardo, virtually as a gift on which Lombardo reaped immense personal profits, so that Lombardo's orchestra would be constantly on call, on a scale and with a stupendousness that was as close as anyone in America ever got to the entertainment afforded by a monarch. The wealth of the empire enabled Moses to keep many city officials in fear. With it, he hired skilled investigators he called bloodhounds, who were kept busy filling dossiers. Every city official knew about those dossiers, and they knew what use Moses was capable of making of them, since the empire's wealth allowed him to create an awesomely efficient public relations machinery. They had seen him dredge up the dark secrets of men's past and turn them into blaring headlines. On the occasion of Paul Scrivane's appointment as city representative to Moses' 1964-65 World Fair, Mayor Wagner said to him, "Paul, my experience with Moses has taught me one lesson, and I'll tell it to you. I would never let him do anything for me in any way, shape, or form. I'd never ask him or permit him to do anything of a personal nature for me because, and I've seen it time and time again, a day will come when Bob will reach back in his file and throw this in your face. Quietly, if that will make you go along with him, publicly otherwise, and if he has to, he will destroy you for it." There were men whose past contained not even a speck of grist for Moses' mill. This, however, was no guarantee against attack. Perhaps their fathers had committed an impropriety. If so, Moses would visit the sins of the fathers on the children. A respected financier, rising in a city planning commission hearing to oppose a zoning change sponsored by Moses, was astounded to hear Moses reply by reading into the hearing transcript newspaper accounts of a scandal unconnected in any way with zoning, in which the financier's father had been involved 40 years before, when the financier was 8 years old. And if Moses possessed no derogatory information at all about an opponent or his forebears, this was still no guarantee against attack, for Moses was an innovator in fields other than public works. He practiced McCarthyism long before there was a McCarthy. He drove a Rexford G. Tugwell out of his city planning commission chairmanship, out of New York, in fact, helped drive Stanley F. Isaacs out of his borough presidency, and destroyed the public careers of a dozen other officials by publicly and falsely identifying them as pinkos or planning reds or followers of the Ogpu, the Soviet secret police. There were 2 widespread communist witch hunts in New York City, one in 1938 and one in 1958. Both relied heavily on information, much of it innuendo or outright falsehood, leaked to newspapers by Moses. The fear in which Moses was held because of these factors was intensified by his memory. Cross him once, politicians said, and he would never forget. And if he ever got the chance for revenge, no consideration would dilute his venom. For a 20-year period that did not end until 1968, Moses was given by the State Department of Public Works a secret veto power over the awarding of all state contracts for public works in the New York metropolitan area. No engineer who had ever forcefully and openly disagreed with the Moses opinion ever received even one of the thousands of contracts involved. Moses was able to shape a city and to build an empire because the supple mind that had conceived of a minor sports association for Yale and innovations in the civil service system for New York City, and also of substantial portions of the New York State Constitution. had focused on the possibilities of an institution still in its infancy as an urban force when he came to it in 1934, the Public Authority. He raised this institution to a maturity in which it became the force through which he shaped New York and its suburbs in the image he personally conceived. Operating through an authority, Moses could keep the public from finding out what he was doing, and this was an important consideration with him. If throughout his half century and more in the public eye, he displayed an eagerness and a flair for publicizing certain aspects of his career and his life, he displayed an equal eagerness and flair for making sure that only those aspects and none others were known. There were, for example, men and women who knew Robert Moses for half a century, who never knew that he had a brother, or that in the city in which Robert Moses lived in luxury, that brother spent the last 30 years of his life in poverty so severe that he lived in a fifth-floor walk-up flat in an old tenement huddled against the piers of South Ferry. The official records of most public agencies are public records, but not those of public authorities, since courts have held that they may be regarded as the records of private corporations, closed to scrutiny by the interested citizen or reporter. This was very important to Robert Moses. It was very important to him that no one be able to find out how it was that he was able to build, because what Robert Moses built on was a lie. The lie had to do with the nature of both man and the public authority. Moses said that he was the antithesis of the politician. He never let political considerations influence any aspect of his projects, not the location of a highway or housing project, nor the award of a contract, nor an insurance commission, he said. He would never compromise, he said. He never had and he never would. That, he said, was the way politicians got things done. But he was no politician. He knew what should be done, and he intended to do it the right way or not at all. He said this at the beginning of his career, and he said it at the end in 1961 at the trial of a borough president who had received favors from an urban renewal contractor. Moses, on the witness stand, was asked whether the contract had not been awarded as part of a deal. Moses' face paled with rage. In 40 years of public life, he said, I have never made a deal. Public authorities are also outside and above politics, Moses said. Their decisions are made solely on the basis of the public welfare, he said. They all have the best features of private enterprise. They are businesslike, prudent, efficient, economical, and they are more. They are the very epitome of prudence, efficiency, economy. And they have another advantage over conventional governmental institutions as well. Since they finance their projects through the sale of revenue bonds to private investors, they therefore build these projects without using any public funds. Projects built by authorities, he said, cost the taxpayers nothing. These statements were believed implicitly for almost 40 years by the public to which they were made, and this is not surprising. For Robert Moses repeated his contentions 1,000 times, and for 4 decades they were repeated, amplified, and embellished by a press that believed them too. Because of the 40 years of adulation of the newspapers and of the public that read the newspapers, for 40 years nothing could stand in Moses' way. No mayor or governor dared to try the beast, the wave of public opinion in whose curl Moses rode. One president tried. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most bitter enemy that Moses ever made in public life, attempted as president to exact vengeance for humiliations previously received at Moses' hands. But although he made his move at the very zenith of his own popularity and prestige, the president found himself forced to retreat by a storm of acclaim for Moses that rolled not only through New York but across the country, and that ironically left Moses embedded more firmly than ever in the public consciousness as the fearless defier of politicians. For 40 years, in every fight, Robert Moses could count on having his side the weight of public opinion. The beliefs on which that opinion was based were never disproved or even seriously questioned, not even during the final bitter decade of Moses' career, a decade during which his policies were subjected to steadily increasing criticism. For even during that decade, the criticism was of Moses' projects more than of the methods by which he accomplished those projects. The reason for this was simple. The vast majority of the public accepted the legend as fact, and even those skeptics who were disposed to test its truth and had no facts with which to make the test, because of the records of Triborough and the mouths of its ministers were so effectively sealed. If, however, they had been able to see the records and open the mouths, they would have learned that the legend was a gigantic hoax. Prudent, efficient, economical, so incredibly wasteful was Moses of the money he told from the public in quarters and dimes that on a single bridge alone he paid 40 million more in interest than he had to. Authority projects cost the taxpayers nothing. Convert loans made to authorities by the state, loans designed never to be repaid, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The cost of city purchased land on which authority facilities were built ran to the hundreds of millions. The cost of taxpayer-financed toll roads leading to authority facilities ran into the billions. And the loss in tax revenue, because authority-controlled land was removed from the tax rolls, drained the city year after year. Most important, had the records of the authorities been opened, they would have disproved another aspect of the lie. The legend that Robert Moses was no politician, that he operated at a higher level, that he managed to create his public works that he operated at a higher level than that implied in the derogatory connotations attached to that noun, that he managed to create his public works at a remove from politics. Actually, as these records prove, Robert Moses' authorities were a political machine oiled by the lubricant of political machines, money. Their wealth enabled Moses to make himself not only a political boss, but a boss who, in his particular bailiwick, public works, was able to exert a power that few political bosses in the more conventional mold ever attain. Even had the records been available, of course, the public might not have understood their significance. For Moses was a political boss with a difference. He was not the stereotype with which Americans were familiar. His constituency was not the public, but some of the most powerful men in the city and state, and he kept these men in line by doling out to them as Tammany Ward bosses once handed out turkeys to the poor at Thanksgiving. The goodies in which such men were interested, the sugar plums of public relations retainers, insurance commissions, and legal fees. I'm going to read one more page. This man, personally honest in matters of money, became the locus of corruption in New York City. Robert Moses made himself the ward boss of the inner circle, the bankroller of the 400 of politics. Far from being above the seamier aspects of politics, he was, for decades, the central figure about whom revolved much of the backstage maneuvering of New York City politics. Triborough's public relations ran to $250,000 a year, its legal fees to $250,000, its insurance commissions to $500,000, it's a total of $1 million a year. Moses parceled out retainers, fees, and commissions to city and state political leaders on the basis of a very exact appraisal of their praise in the political pecking order. An examination of the records of the recipients leads to the conclusion that year after year, it was the men who received Moses' turkey baskets who fought against any this is a word I don't say out loud a lot, diminution in Moses' power, and for whatever public works project he was pushing at the moment. Beyond graft and patronage, moreover, Moses also displayed a genius for using the wealth of his public authorities to unite behind his aims banks. Labor unions, contractors, bond underwriters, insurance firms, the great retail stores, real estate manipulators, all the forces which enjoy immense behind-the-scenes political influence in New York City. He succeeded in mobilizing behind his banner economic forces with sufficient weight to bend his aims the apparatus so carefully established in city charter and state constitution to ensure that in deciding on such projects, the decisive voice would be that of the people. He used economic power for political ends so successfully that in the field he carved out for his own, fields in which decisions would shape the city's future for generations, if not for centuries, he made economic, not democratic, forces the forces that counted in New York. And because he spoke for such forces, it was his voice that counted most of all. He gave everybody involved in the political setup in the city whatever it was they wanted, one official recalls. Therefore, they all had their own interest in seeing him succeed. The pressure that this interest all added up to was a pressure no one in the system could stand up against because it came from the system itself. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We're in the middle bottom of page 18. Thanks for coming. I hope this is fun. Sorry I have been misspeaking a little bit. The sentences are very long and they use punctuation sort of arbitrarily. And so it's kind of hard to read aloud, but it's a good challenge. And I think it's really good so far. Yesterday I was so excited to read this morning. Thank you. Bye.